So welcome everybody. I'll start from the beginning. I'm Laurel McDonald. I'm the director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. To begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to work on it. So on behalf of the University of Toronto Libraries, I wish to welcome you to the 11th annual Leon and Johanna Katz Memorial Lecture. The Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library has been very lucky to have such a wonderful supporter, such as Johanna Katz, and we're very grateful for the tremendous support that she's provided the Fisher over the years for this most remarkable lecture series. We're also very pleased to see so many of her friends here with us this evening to remember Johanna and Leon. So we're very, very grateful that you could join us. Now, over the years, for the last 11 years, this lecture series has brought us wonderful speakers from across Canada to speak about book history and the book arts. And this evening is no exception. I'm very honored and very pleased to have Charles Pachter with us this evening. I think Charles Pachter can be described as a modern-day Renaissance man. He is a painter, a sculptor, an historian, a designer, a printmaker, and a lecturer. He's basically the leading contemporary artist in Canada. Many of his images are iconic to us. The image of the Queen, an image of a moose, the Canadian flag, certainly one of my favorite pieces of artwork, which is the College Street subway station with the hockey players at it, which is excellent. Charles Pachter's work has been displayed at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the McMichael, as well as the ROM. He has also published and produced numerous books, including best-selling children's books, Canada Counts, M is for Moose. He's also published with Margaret Atwood the illustrated journals of Susannah, Moody as well. He's been greatly recognized for all of his efforts. He is an officier of the French Order of Arts and Letters. He is an officer he is a member of the Canadian, an officer of the Order of Canada, as well as a member of the Ontario Order as well. He also has honorary doctorates from Brock University, OCAD University, as well as the University of Toronto. So it's a great honor and a great pleasure to welcome Charles Pachter. So thank you.
Wow, did you know all of that by heart? That was amazing. Am I impressed? I'm delighted to be here, to see a few familiar faces. I'd like to acknowledge Leon and Johanna, who were dear friends, and especially to the memory of Richard Landon, who initiated my involvement with this wonderful institution. Back in the 90s, I started giving him my papers and my letters at his request, and it's been an ongoing odyssey since then. Very, very special with Jennifer Tays as well. So I'm really thrilled to be able to share some of this history with you. Life is full of serendipitous moments. I met Margaret Atwood at summer camp in Haliburton in 1960. At the time, she looked like a young Jane Goodall. She had a little hut in a swamp, and people called her Peggy Nature. I was Charlie A&C, Arts and Crafts. And she had this hut full of snakes and frogs and toads and worms and whatever. And she called me over one day in front of the squirming campers and said, "I want you to stroke this toad to prove to the kids that you won't get warts." So I stroked the toad and we became lifelong friends. And I'm thankful that she's going to be 80 in November and I'm 76, and we're still there for each other. It's a very, very special friendship. But she recognized early on my love of poetry and words, and she immediately seconded me to look at her early poems. She sent me this first book. If you'll notice, it's signed M.E. Atwood. She didn't want anybody to know whether she was male or female at the time. It was a nice neutral initial. But this original first book that she published, I believe, is now in the Thomas Fisher Library as well. Here we were in 1964. She asked me to illustrate her first novel, The Edible Woman, and there it was. These are photographs I took of her back then. And I went off to the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, a beautiful American institution, one of the finest campuses in the States. After doing an art history degree at U of T, I went off to Cranbrook to do a master's in painting and graphics, and I ended up spending 2 years illustrating her poems that she sent to me from Edmonton and Vancouver, where she was teaching. And here I was on this beautiful campus. That's me with hair back in 1965, printing my very first book of hers, The Circle Game, which has become something of a collector's item. There were only 15 copies. I printed it by hand. The paper was made from crunched up blue jeans, as you can see there. And there it is. There were only 15 copies of it done in 1964. And this was Atwood at her most, I have to say in front of all of you, that as much as I love her novels, and I've had some problems with the later stuff, I do believe her poetry is transcendent. It's so beautiful and so easy to relate to, and so clear and precise and wonderful. I am going to read one or two poems, which we will get to in a little while. This, for example, is her poem that looks almost, my illustration is almost Matisse-like. You'll see. Some very powerful imagery. There were only 8 poems and lithographs in this entire collection. And there is the colophon. This letter from Margaret, I'll see if I can see it from here. This is typical of Margaret. When I sent her the finished copy, she was teaching in Edmonton, 1964, in Vancouver rather. Dear Charlie, it arrived yesterday. I was so excited I just took it out into the hall and undid mummy-like wrappings for a half an hour until I finally uncovered it. And is it ever a stunner? I am really thrilled with it. It functions so well as a unit. The type is just right, and you manage to include so much detail from the poems. That mood, too, is perfect. Anyway, it goes on and on and on, and she says, I love the cover and the end papers. The single circle is very chaste, my dear. I like that, but I must especially mention the second last with the sink and that marvelous ear-like sort of embryo shape, too, and the bee. Anyway, you can get it. She said, so you get 2,000 gold stars. What are you working on now? Love and kisses, Peggy. She was such an inspiration to me from the earliest time on. She was my muse, and everything I did, she supported unequivocally. So I was just really lucky to have met her when I did, and to be able to continue this relationship over the years. At Cranbrook, as I said, I began illustrating more of her poems. Look at her, here she was this little mouse from Victoria College. There, next one. Yes, that was me. Again, typical, magnificent Atwood, walking on the beach in British Columbia. Pebbles. Talking was difficult. Instead, we gathered colored pebbles from the places on the beach where they occurred. They were sea-smoothed, sea-completed. They enclosed what they intended to mean in shapes as random and necessary as the shapes of words. And when finally we spoke, the sounds of our voices fell into the air, single and solid and rounded and really there. And then dulled, and then like sounds gone, A fistful of gathered pebbles there was no point in taking home, dropped on a beach full of other colored pebbles. And when we turned to go, a flock of small birds flew, scattered by the fright of our sudden, I can't read it, so small here, and disappeared. Hard sea pebbles thrown solid for an instant against the sky, flight of words. She was 25 when she wrote that, okay? And then this gets pretty powerful. Through the wilderness of the flesh, across the mind's ice expanses, we hunt each other. I keep being afraid I will find you dead in the snow. When will you be found? The power of her and the simplicity and the easy comprehension of her words is just totally remarkable. So I did a whole series of the Atwood books when I was at Cranbrook. I was influenced early on by the works of Ben Shahn and Leonard Baskin, the American graphic artists. And then one of our most famous collaboration, the Speeches for Dr. Frankenstein, which is in the U of T collection. These are silk screens and wood cuts and linoleum cuts. And this was all preparatory for the biggest project of all, which we're coming to, the Journals of Susannah Moody. This is a tiny little one, only 12 copies. It was called Kaleidoscopes Baroque. The first kind, when held up against the light, changed colored glass, cut plastic, scraps of metal into starbursts and austere shapes, sharp-edged flowers, each broken shard a petal. Again, there she was. This was a lithograph I did of Margaret up at a farm that I had in Oro-Medonte, north of Barrie, with Angela Bowering from Vancouver. It's called Charles Pachter, in a field. I went off to Expo 67 in Montreal. There was no way I was going to miss Expo at age 25. And I worked there because I was lucky enough to have studied at the Sorbonne, and the Montreal snobs hired me, puisque j'étais bien influent dans cette belle langue française, même que j'étais torontois. And I worked there for 2 years. And here's a print I did of Margaret called It Was Fascination, I Know, from up at my farm again. She's holding a caterpillar and turning into a butterfly. More of my work from what I euphemistically called my fucked up period in my 20s when I was trying to sort myself out. This is me in prison with my happy parents on the other side. And the title of the print, Funny What Love Can Do. But these early lithos are an expressionist period of my work, which many people today are surprised to see, because I have been I've gone through 5 or 6 different decades, and this was my early expressionist stuff, which never changed until after I went out to Calgary in 1969. That's me and Margaret at my opening in Calgary in 1970, and they called her poetess, which is not a word she liked. I was dressed as Elton John, and she was Joan Crawford. There we were, back in 1970. And in Calgary, I was doing a lot of printmaking as well. There we were back at Camp White Pine in 1980, 15 years after it was at a reunion at the camp. Again, prints that I did in Calgary. Goldie Hawn is the Mona Lisa, the Bow River in the background. And then I came back to Toronto and I got into the whole pop art regime. In every Canadian art magazine at that time had pictures by American artists. We were brought up with this ridiculous colonial mindset that if it came from elsewhere, it was consequential. If it came from here, who do you think you are? And I had to deal with that. But when Andy Warhol was doing soup cans, I came back to Toronto and did The Red Rocket, and did a whole series that opened at the Isaacs Gallery in 1972. And then the Great Epiphany. This is long before Photoshop. I read somewhere that the Queen was coming to Niagara-on-the-Lake to open the Shaw Festival Theatre, designed by Ron Tom in June of 1973. I showed these images to Av, and believe it or not, this great champion of Canadian art said, "I don't have to show these, and I don't have to tell you why." They were worried that in those years, people revered the monarchy, and they thought that I was being mischievous, and they were worried that I would get into trouble because of it. In a moment of great Warholian madness, I decided to open the show myself. I lived on a street called Shaw Street, and I called my show the Other Shaw Festival. And I had Margaret Atwood pouring tea on the lawn, and Joyce Wieland, and Greg Curnow, and everybody was there. It was a marvelous Canadian moment of fun. And I'm going to go back to this. A friend of mine, Larry Brenzel, had a 54 Rolls Royce, and his wife sat in the car all afternoon in a hat and a glove waving like this in the Rolls Royce. It made headlines around the world. Canada in royal rage over Queen on Moose, monarchists threatened to slash canvases, artists warned to stay indoors. The whole thing was hyped to beyond, it was ridiculous. P.S. I never sold one painting. And I began to wonder what it was about Canadian culture that made, collectors and institutions buying art from everywhere else. But if you were an artist from here, they would say, "Who do you think you are?" And I had to deal with that then. But I gradually came to understand what it was about. This painting is owned by Lorraine Monk. Do any of you remember Lorraine, the wonderful photography expert? Her kids are fighting over it. We think it should be in the National Gallery, but it won't be for a long time, until probably after the Queen is gone and I'm gone, but it'll be a piece of history. 1974, I was a bit of a real estate junkie, so I bought this old building at 24 Ryerson Avenue, right beside Theatre Passe Muraille, for $90,000 with Margaret Atwood's help. Guess what it just sold for to the Toronto School of Art? I was forced to sell it in 1981 when the interest rates went up to 23%. It just sold to the Toronto School of Art for $6.75 million. Tempus fugit, there you go. And this was my loft up on the top floor. There I was with Margaret in 1974 at her farm up in Alliston. Portrait I did of her then. Up at my farm with Paul Thompson, Rick Salutin, Graham Gibson, and Margaret, 1978. With her young daughter Jess at the time. Jess is now 42 and has her own baby. Portrait I did of her in 1980, which Lorraine Monk bought from me and sold it to the Portrait Gallery of Canada for $65,000. So she did well. I got a smile out of it, but there you are. This is one that Margaret wanted, so she now has that hanging in her home. In 1981, I had become something of the king of Queen Street. I was buying up old dumps and fixing them up, and we opened a restaurant called Gracie's. Anybody remember Gracie's? We had a Scarborough room, a Mississauga room, a Rosedale room, and a Forest Hill room. And at the Scarborough room, all the food was from the Kate Aiken cookbook. Rice Krispie Squares, Jell-O mold, really bad Canadian food, but everybody would rent it for birthday parties. And there's Margaret at Gracie's, and those were the rec room lamps my mother had that I made into and there's Peter Newman. Gracie's only lasted 2 years, and then the recession of 1981 came, where interest rates went up to 23%, and we were killed. But at that time, Margaret had, earlier on in 1968, when I was still at Expo, Margaret sent me her first manuscript of the journals of Susannah Moody when she was in Boston. And I was so blown away by it. I couldn't believe how brilliant it was. I remember reading Roughing It in the Bush in high school. We all did. The quintessential book about immigration to Canada in the 19th century. But when Margaret sent me this on yellow foolscap from Boston, I knew instantly that it was her greatest poetic achievement, and I vowed that I was going to find a way to print it. We were turned down by the Canada Council. What else is new? The rejection letter is now here in the U of T library. And my mother, bless her heart, said, I got a $500 tax receipt for it. My mother said, you see, it wasn't a total loss. But I started printing the journals of Susannah Moody in 1980. I met two Spanish printers down on Niagara Street, Manuel and Abel Bello Sanchez. And for 9 months, we printed the journals of Susannah Moody and turned it into this large codex of 30 illustrated images. There I am painting with what's called touche, T-U-S-C-H-E. It's a suspension of ink in liquid. Here I was doing all these illustrations. And here we have Atwood at her most brilliant. Here she is describing, this is one of the images out of 30 in the book, where she's describing the cholera epidemic and, as you know, the people who were quarantined in the 1840s who came to Quebec and Ontario. Further arrivals. After we had crossed the long illness that was the ocean, we sailed upriver. On the first island, the immigrants threw off their clothes and danced like sandflies. We left behind, one by one, the cities rotting with cholera, one by one our civilized distinctions, and entered a large darkness. It was our own ignorance we entered. I have not come out yet. My brain gropes nervous tentacles in the night, sends out fears hairy as bears, demands lamps, or waiting for my shadowy husband, hears malice in the trees' whispers. I need wolf's eyes to see the truth. I refuse to look in a mirror. Whether the wilderness is real or not depends on who lives there. Now this is poetry. Okay. And it inspired me so much, I just couldn't stop. Every time the printers had finished one page, we'd get on to the next one. And we literally worked for 9 months to complete the book. This is another one, the planters. They moved between the jagged edge of the forest and the jagged river on a stumpy patch of cleared land. My husband, a neighbor, another man weeding the few rows of string beans and dusty potatoes. They bend, straighten, the sun lights up their faces and hands, candles flickering in the wind against the unbright earth. I see them. I know none of them believe they are here. They deny the ground they stand on, pretend this dirt is the future, and they are right. If they let go of that illusion, solid to them as a shovel, open their eyes even for a moment to these trees, to this particular sun, they would be surrounded, stormed, broken in upon by branches, roots, tendrils, the dark side of light, as I am. And here I was printing all these images, as I said. Those are the two printers. There's the pages all stacked up of the original book. There is a copy of the original here in the Thomas Fisher. And there we were peeling the pages. We had to bleed print many of the pages off a sub-page. And this was Pam the Ripper. She had to rip the edges on the bottom. She was the girlfriend of one of the printers, and we spent nearly a month in this loft on Queen Street getting all the pages ready. And here's the finished book, which came out in 1980. There it is. It's like a giant codex with 30 original silk screens. And then finally, he said modestly, it has been hailed as our finest achievement of a collaboration between a Canadian poet and a Canadian artist. It's been written about everywhere, and we are very proud of it. as you can imagine. There we were back in 1990. Another page. This one is very special. If you look at she talks about the death of a young son by drowning. You see the last line? I planted him in this country like a flag. Guess what this inspired me to do? My series of flag paintings, which I started in 1980. I had a big show that opened the night Pierre Trudeau had announced the patriation of the Constitution back on Queen Street, November the 7th, 1981. I was always struggling with the fact that the Globe and Mail art critic hated me, John Bentley Mays, and whatever I did, he found a way to trash me. And the morning, all of Toronto came to this opening, the Toronto that doesn't exist anymore. Pierre Burton, Barbara Frum, Peter Zosky, June Callwood, everybody knew everybody then. They came to this celebration of our beautiful flag. The next day in the Globe and Mail, John Bentley Mays wrote, "More over the couch art for the walls of patriotic dentists." That's what I was dealing with. Unfortunately, this man had problems with depression, and he wrote a book called The Black Dogs of Depression that got him a Governor General's Award. But because of John Bentley Mays, and he was constantly on my case, I ended up inventing my own fake art critic who loved my work with a double-barreled name. Get this. The hint is he comes from Three Rivers, and his name, Don Rouge Humber. And I used to take out ads in the Globe and Mail on the Saturday afternoon. And I would quote Don, who would say, "So stunning words fail me, a legend in his own mind." And other artists would write to me and say, "Who is this guy who loves your work so much, and how do we get him to write about us?" Well, to give you some example of how I never looked back after inventing Don Rouge Humber, I'm sitting in my gallery one afternoon on the Moose Factory on Grange Avenue, and I'm going, oh, retail is so boring, why am I doing this? A guy walked in, thick German accent, and ended up buying 10 paintings, and I couldn't believe my luck. And I said, "Do you mind my asking, how did you hear about me anyway?" He said, "Well, I've known of your work for years, but I see this glowing review in Globe and Mail from Don Rouge Humber." At which point I thought, what do I do now? I don't want to lose the sale. On the other hand, he could sue me for fraud. So I decided to tell him. I said, well, there's something you should know. I made up Don Rouge Humber. He's my alter ego. He kept writing the check, and he said, "In that case, do I make this out to you or to him?" And since that time, I have never looked back, because I had to deal with the reality of the Canadian art world. And as an unabashed entrepreneur and maverick, I found by the time I turned 60 that I was way better off selling my own work. I was better at doing it than the dealers were. As you know, dealers take 50% and they don't buy the art. So for artists, it's very, very tough. And not that many artists are good at business. I was one of the lucky ones. I was blessed with a variety of skills, so I just decided to run with it by the time I turned 60. Again, Atwood, this is so brilliant. Here she is. And here she was reading at, there's several videos of us reading Susannah Moody together. They are on YouTube. And I did this portrait of Susannah Moody called Pioneer. I got the actress Janet Amos to pose for me back in 1982, and it became the set piece for the trade edition that was published 2 years ago. This was bought by collectors in New York. What else is new? And here it is on the cover of the new edition, which is only $40, and it has the same, doesn't have the sweep of the original, but it really does work, and I've gotten wonderful response from it. This was one of the illustrations, is on the side of the Toronto Public Library, of all places, down at Front and Bathurst. With great respect to the architects. It doesn't work as much as I would have wanted it to, but it's interesting, as you can see. It's on the wall of the, you have to be in a certain place at a certain time to see it, but it's quite interesting. And the final poem in Susannah Moody, which I will share with you. She ends up to be the ghost of a little old lady on the bus in the 20th century. She said, "A bus along St. Clair, December. It would take more than that to banish me. This is my kingdom still. Turn, look up through the gritty window, an unexplored wilderness of wires. Though they buried me in monuments of concrete slabs, of cables, though they mounted a pyramid of cold light over my head, though they said, 'We will build silver paradise with a bulldozer.' It shows how little they know about vanishing. I have my ways of getting through. Right now, the snow is no more familiar to you than it was to me. This is my doing. The gray air, the roar going on behind it are no more familiar. I am the old woman sitting across from you on the bus, her shoulders drawn up like a shawl. Out of her eyes come secret hat pins, destroying the walls, the ceiling. Turn, look down. There is no city. This is the center of a forest. Your place is empty." Almost makes you shiver. And this is the moment of pride when you create a colophon page, which describes how the book was done, and it's all signed by the author, the artist, the printers, and the binder. Toronto, 1980. 39 years ago, is it possible? Wow. Now, Keith and I got married last August in Aurelia. This is Keith, wave Keith, from Aurelia. And Margaret insisted on being, are you ready? The handmaid of honor. It was pretty special. So we had a whole group of handmaids, and there we were. And now I'm going to jump quickly because she introduced me to two other poets, Alden Nolan and John Newlove. These were books I did with them. I'm not going to read them, just to give you some idea. It wasn't all just Margaret. John Newlove, prairie poet. This was a book of, oh my goodness, welcome to 2020. I turn off my phone. Yep. This was a book of medieval Hebrew prayers that I published as well, all handmade. A very dear friend of mine at the Cranbrook Academy of the Art, a Korean artist. I illustrated some of her works. And then finally, I did this one in 1965, and I'm sharing it with you because it gives you some idea of where I was at even then. I got started with kids' books. Watch this. This was all silk screen, okay? It was a kid's song that I learned at camp. I said, "Good morning to the sun, good morning to the moon, good morning to the chickens and the hens." I said, "Good morning to the rooster, good morning to the cows, good morning to the piggies in their pens." I said, good morning to everything in sight. And by the time I got through with saying good morning, it was time to say good night to the sun, good night to the moon, good night to the chickens and the hens. I said good night to the rooster, good night to the cows, good night to the piggies in their pens. I said good night to everything that's born. And by the time I got through saying good night, it was time to say good morning to the sun. This book I printed when I was 22 years old at Cranbrook. I tried to get it published, and I did not know that the song that I'd learned at camp was originally a song that Betty Comden and Adolph Green sang on Broadway in 1965. And Holt Reinhardt and Winston ended up doing their own version of it, which is very syrupy and icky. And I still to this day have never printed it. And I'm hoping now that in this new age we're in where you can print your own stuff, I think I'll probably end up doing it. There it was, back in 1965, and there were only 15 copies of it. And I do believe there's one here at the Thomas Fisher as well, which I'm pleased to have. Anyway, it's been a delight sharing all of this with you. I hope that I haven't bored you. And thank you so much for listening, and there we are.